There is a hill in the west of Ireland, and if you stand on it at dusk in the failing light of autumn, you will understand something that no book can teach you. The wind drops, the birds go quiet, and the ground under your feet stops feeling like ground and starts feeling like a door. For most of us, that sensation lasts a second, and then reason takes it back and tells us it was nothing. But there were people who lived on these hills for 2,000 years who did not take it back. They did not decide they had imagined it. They decided they were right. And what they believed about that door, about what was waiting on the other side of it, is not a fairy tale. It is one of the most complete and most misunderstood systems of belief that Europe ever produced. Tonight, I am going to take you all the way through it. I am going to show you a world that the old Irish insisted was real. A world of gods who did not die but hid. Of a man who came home 300 years too late. Of children who were carried off and swapped for something that only looked like a child. And of drowned cities whose bells, according to people who swore they heard them, still ring beneath the sea. And I am going to make you a promise that will feel uncomfortable long before the end. By the time this is over, you will realize that close to 1 billion people on this planet still perform the rituals of this belief every single year. In costumes, by candlelight, going from door to door, and almost none of them have the faintest idea what they are actually doing. This is not the story of little winged creatures at the bottom of a garden. This is the theology of a civilization, and it begins with a single strange idea that changes everything the moment you accept it. The first thing you have to unlearn is the word fairy itself. When the old Irish spoke of the beings in the hills, they did not mean anything small, or pretty, or harmless. They did not use a word like fairy at all. They used a word that in modern spelling we write as she, and they said it softly, the way you say the name of something you would rather not attract the attention of. And the reason for that caution is the idea I promised you, the idea that reorganizes everything else. The otherworld of the Irish is not somewhere else. It is here. It is not above the clouds, and it is not down in some distant pit at the center of the earth. It occupies the same ground you are standing on, the same lake you could throw a stone into, the same mist that gathers in the low fields before dawn. It is separated from you not by distance, but by something far thinner and far more unsettling. It is separated from you by perception itself. The membrane between the mortal world and the other world is not a wall you would have to travel to reach. It is a veil that is always beside you, and in the right place, at the right hour, in the right state of attention, it can simply open. That is why certain places in Ireland carry a weight that has nothing to do with their size. The Hill of Tara, Knocknarea in Sligo with its great stone cairn crowning the summit, the strange grey limestone pavement of the Burren, the bend of the River Boyne where the oldest mounds stand. These are not merely ancient or beautiful. In the belief, they are thin places, points where the veil has worn almost through, where the door is closest to the surface. And here is the detail that tells you how deep this runs. The word for those doorways, and the word for the beings behind them, and the word for the green mounds that mark them on the landscape, is the same word. She. To call a mound a she is to say it is not a hill at all. It is a threshold. It is a house. And it is occupied. To understand how seriously that was taken, look at the oldest doorways of all, older than the Irish themselves. Along the Boyne there are 3 great mounds, and the largest of them, Newgrange, was raised roughly 5,000 years ago by a people who were here long before anyone who could be called Celtic ever set foot on the island. When the storytellers of early Ireland looked at these mounds, they were already impossibly old, ruins from a lost age, and imagination did with them what imagination always does with the unexplained. It filled them with gods. But the people who built Newgrange were not simple, and this is the fact that should stop you where you stand. They cut a long stone passage into the heart of the mound, and they aligned it with a precision we can still measure today, so that on one morning of the year, the shortest day, the very turn of the winter solstice, the first light of the rising sun runs the whole length of that passage and fills the chamber at the center. For about 17 minutes the inside of the tomb is lit. Then the light withdraws, and the darkness closes again for another year. Sit with what that means. A chamber built to hold the burnt bones of the dead, sealed in stone, dark for 364 days, and then, for a quarter of an hour on the darkest morning of the winter, flooded with the light of the living world. The house of the dead, entered by the sun. To the people who inherited these mounds, that was not architecture. That was a demonstration. The membrane between the living and the dead was not fixed and final. It was made to open. And the ones who lived inside were not gone. They were home. So if the otherworld is a real place, what does it look like? The old texts are not vague about this, and that is one of the things that surprises people most. They do not describe a single hazy paradise. They describe named regions, each with its own character, the way you might describe the provinces of a country you have actually walked through. There is Tir na Nog, the land of the young, the most famous of them, where no one ages and no one sickens and no one dies, where the trees are always in fruit and the music never stops, and where a single day may cost you 100 years on the outside. Hold on to that. Later it is going to break your heart. There is Mag Mell, the plain of honey, sometimes called the Great Plain, a country of endless festival, where the harvest is always in and winter never comes, and where the feast that is in full flow when you arrive has been going on forever and will never end. There is Tir Fotún, the land under the wave, and that one is different in kind. That one is not warm and golden. It lies beneath the sea. It answers to a keeper we will meet before the night is out, and it is older and colder and stranger than anything under the green hills. And there is Tech Duinn, the House of Dawn, the darkest corner of the whole map, a bare rock off the southwestern coast, where the Lord of the Dead holds his hall, and to which, the Irish believed, the souls of the dead travel first, before they go anywhere else at all. The doorways to these places were not only the mounds, they were also the lakes, where a road might seem to run down under the water, and the deep wells, and the caves, any place where the solid world gave way and hinted at another one behind it. And what matters here is not the list of names. What matters is that the old texts treat these places as real. People travel to them. People come back. People carry things out of them and are marked by them, in ways the stories record with the flat seriousness of testimony rather than the looseness of a bedtime tale. The otherworld, in this belief, is not a place you go to once, at the end, when you die. It is a place pressed up against your life continuously, that certain people can see into, and that, at certain hours of the year, opens on its own. But a door is only frightening because of what stands behind it. So who are they? Ask most people what the Irish fairies actually are, and you will get one of two answers, and both of them are wrong, though the second is wrong in an interesting way. The first answer is the modern one, the small winged creature with the pointed ears and the taste for mischief, the version that fits neatly on a greeting card. That version is a late invention, sentiment poured over an old tradition that had almost no sentiment in it. The second answer is closer. The fairies, this answer says, are the old gods of Ireland, who withdrew when human beings took the land. That is essentially true. But the story of how the gods of Ireland became the fairies of Ireland is one of the strangest transformations in all of European myth, and it deserves to be told properly, because every single thing that follows depends on it. The medieval Irish wrote down a history of their own island, a long account of the peoples who came to Ireland one after another, which we now call the Book of Invasions. Wave after wave arrived, settled the land, and was overtaken in turn by the next. And then came the fourth people, and they were not like the ones before them. They were called the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Danu. And they were not settlers with plows and cattle. They were divine. They came, the story says, out of 4 cities in the far north of the world, cities that stand on no map. And from each of those cities they carried one treasure. From Phalius they brought the Lia Fail, the stone of destiny, which would cry out under the feet of a rightful king. From Gorias they brought the great spear of Lugh, and no battle was ever won against the hand that held it. From Findius they brought the sword of Nuada, and no one it struck ever escaped. And from Mirius they brought the cauldron of the Dagda, from which no company ever went away hungry. A stone, a spear, a sword, a cauldron. Earth and fire and air and water. The complete set of the powers of the world, carried in the hands of its gods. And they were not a rabble of equals. They had a hierarchy, a family, a division of powers, and their greatest figures are among the most vivid characters any mythology has ever produced. There is the Dagda, whose name means the good god. And you have to be careful with that word good, because it does not mean kind. It means good at everything, capable, complete. He carried a club so heavy it had to be dragged behind him on wheels, and one end of it killed the living, while the other end brought back the dead. He owned a cauldron that never emptied, and a great harp that could turn the seasons and command the feelings of any man who heard it played. He was enormous, and driven by appetite, and half ridiculous, and utterly sovereign, the raw power of the divine with all the manners stripped off. There is the Morrígan, whose name is best translated as the Great Queen, or the Phantom Queen, and she is the one you would least want to notice you. She is the goddess of fate and war and death, and she moves across the field of battle in the shape of a crow, watching men who are about to die. She does not so much fight as decide. There is a story that tells you everything about her. She came to Cuchulainn, the greatest warrior Ireland ever produced, and she offered him her love. And he, young and proud and thinking only of the fight in front of him, refused her. That refusal did not turn her into his enemy in the way a scorned lover becomes an enemy. It was worse than that. She simply became the shape his death would take. She turned herself into an eel and tripped him at a river ford. She turned herself into a wolf and drove cattle across his path. She turned herself into a heifer and broke his line at the worst moment. And step by patient step, across the whole length of his short and blazing life, she arranged the circumstances that would kill him. And at the very end, when he lashed himself upright to a standing stone so that he could meet his death on his feet, it was a crow that settled on his shoulder to tell his enemies that the greatest man in Ireland was finally gone. She was not cruel. She was fate. And fate does not forgive being turned down. Their first king was Nuada, and there is a reason it was Lugh and not Nuada who led the gods in their greatest war. Nuada had lost his hand in an earlier battle, and by the old law of the Tuatha Dé Danann, no man could be king who was not whole in his body. He was given a new hand, worked in silver, and it earned him a name that has come down the centuries, Nuada of the Silver Arm. But a silver hand is not a living one, and for a long time the kingship slipped away from him. There, at the very top of the pantheon, is the flaw at the heart of the divine, the rule that even a god must be perfect to lead. And that is precisely the gap that Lugh walks into. Lugh, called Lugh of the Long Arm, is the master of every art there is, and there is a scene at the gates of Tara that is one of the small, perfect moments of Irish myth. Lugh arrives, a stranger, and asks to be let in and given a place among the Tuatha Dé Danann. The gatekeeper asks him what he can do because no one enters who cannot bring a skill the court does not already possess. Lugh says he is a builder. "We have a builder," says the gatekeeper. Lugh says he is a smith. "We have a smith." A warrior. "We have one of those." A harper, a poet, a keeper of the old history, a worker of magic, a healer. Each time the answer comes back the same. We already have a master of that one. And then Lugh asks the question that opens the gate. Do you have, he says, one single man who is master of all of them at once? And they do not. And so he walks in, and before very long he is leading them, because he is the complete being, the one who is not merely great at a thing, but great at everything. And it is Lugh who becomes the hinge on which the whole war of the gods turns. Because the Tuatha Dé Danann had an enemy, and their enemy was ancient. They were called the Fomorians, and it is far too easy to file them under the word evil and move on. They were more troubling than evil. They were the powers that had been here before order, the forces of blight and storm and the barren, drowning sea. And their name has been read to mean something like the ones from under, the dark powers from below. Their champion was Balor, and Balor had a single eye, and that eye was a weapon. Its gaze was so poisonous that one look could wither an army where it stood. The lid over it was so vast and so heavy that it took 4 men with hooks and ropes to haul it open. And it was opened only on the battlefield, only when it was time to kill everything in front of it. Now hold those two facts side by side. A being whose eye can destroy an army, and a young god who is the master of every skill there is. They met at the second battle of Mag Tuired, the battle that would decide who held Ireland. And as Balor's attendants began, slowly, to lever open that terrible eye, Lugh did not answer power with power. He reached for the humblest weapon on the whole field, a sling and a single stone. And he drove that stone through Balor's opening eye with such force that it passed clean out through the back of his skull. And the eye, still turning, still burning, fell backward onto the ranks of the Fomorians drawn up behind him. The weapon that was made to end the world turned around and consumed the ones who carried it. The Fomorians broke and scattered, and the gods had won. But nothing in this belief is permanent, and here is where the story turns into something no other mythology quite manages. After the gods came one more people, the last of them, the Milesians, and they were mortal. They were, in the story, the ancestors of the Irish themselves. They came, they wanted the land, and there was a battle. And here is the strange part. The gods lost. Or rather, the gods chose not to win. They did not fight it out to the last. They accepted the outcome. And then, instead of dying, and instead of leaving, they did the thing that created everything we have been talking about. They went down. They made an agreement, and the Dagda divided the hidden country among them, mound by mound, so that each of the great gods was given a doorway of his own, a hollow hill, an entrance to the parallel world lying just beneath the very island the mortals were now walking on top of. And a being of the sea, whom we will come to soon, gave them the gifts they would need to live unseen. A cloak that turned them invisible. Pigs that could be killed and eaten one night and would be whole and alive again the next morning. Ale that kept them from ever growing old. And so the gods of Ireland did not die and did not depart. They became the Sidhe. They became the people of the hollow hills. Think for a moment how unusual that is. In almost every other tradition, gods who are replaced are either forgotten or reduced to something lesser. They fade out. In Ireland, the old gods simply moved house. They went one layer down and stayed, present, watchful, sometimes generous, frequently dangerous, still holding all their old power, choosing the hidden world over the visible one. And remember the great mound on the Boyne, the one aligned to the winter sun? In the stories, that mound was given to a young god called Angus, the god of love and youth. And there is a tale of how he came to hold it forever. By a trick of words, asking only to stay in the mound for a day and a night, and then keeping it for all time, on the grounds that every life is only a string of days and nights. So the house of the dead, lit once a year by the rising sun, became the house of the god of love. That is the kind of thing this mythology does. It refuses to keep its categories tidy. Death and love and the sun and the dead, all living in the same lit chamber. And every single thing the Irish did for the next 2,000 years, every offering left at a threshold, every road that curved to avoid a mound, every warning whispered over a cradle, grows out of that one decision. The gods did not leave, they went under, and under they remained. Which raises the obvious and dangerous question: if they are right there, one layer down, can you reach them? Can you cross? And the answer, in every story the Irish ever told, is yes, you can. People do it, in the tales, all the time. Sometimes they are invited. Sometimes they stumble through a door they never knew was there. And occasionally they walk in on purpose, uninvited, which is always the worst idea of all. But the crossing is never free, and the rules that govern it are fixed and consistent and enforced without mercy. And the first of those rules is the one that turns the beautiful stories into tragedies. Time, on the other side, does not run at the speed of time here. This is not a small inconvenience. It is the trap at the center of everything. Inside the Otherworld, time moves slowly, gently, almost not at all. You do not feel it pass. You do not age. A stay that feels to you like a single golden year may be 100 years on the outside, or 300, and you will have no way of knowing because inside, every moment feels like an eternal and perfect present. The most beautiful and the most devastating illustration of this is the story of Oisín. And I promised you, at the very start, a man who came home 300 years too late. This is him. Oisín was the son of Finn MacCool, the greatest of the old heroes, and he was himself a poet and a warrior of the warband called the Fianna. One morning he was riding along the shore when a woman came toward him out of the direction of the sea, on a white horse whose hooves left no mark at all in the wet sand. Her hair was the color of gold, and her cloak was the color of the water behind her. And her name was Niamh, and she was a princess of the land of the young. She had heard of Oisín. She had crossed the sea for him. She described her country to him, the deathless trees, the rivers, the music, the beauty that never faded, and she did not order him to come with her. She asked, and he went. They rowed out over the waves and into Tír na nÓg, and it was everything she had promised. He was loved. He was happy. Time did not lay a finger on him. But he was a mortal man, and mortal men, even in paradise, eventually think of home. He asked Niamh to let him go back, just once, just to see his father's house again, just to walk the hills where he had hunted with the Fianna. And she agreed, but she gave him one command, and only one. She gave him her white horse, and she told him that his feet must not touch the soil of Ireland. He could ride, he could look, but he must not, for any reason at all, get down. And Oisín rode back across the sea, and he came to Ireland, and Ireland was wrong. The hills were the same hills, but the people had grown smaller, and their faces were strange to him. And the great house of his father was a green mound of tumbled stone with grass grown thick over it. He stopped men on the road and asked after Fionn and the Fianna, and they looked at him the way you look at a man who is not well. Those are old stories, they told him. Those men have been dead 300 years. 300 years. To him, it had been 3. Everyone he had ever loved was gone. Not lately, but centuries gone, folded so far back into the past that they had become legend to the people now living on their land. And then comes the moment that has been landing like a blow on Irish listeners for 1,000 years. Riding on, Oisín passed some men struggling to lift a heavy stone, and, being who he was, a hero of the Fianna, he leaned down from the saddle to help them. And the girth of the saddle snapped, and he fell. and the instant his body touched the ground of Ireland, 300 years arrived in him all at once. He did not simply grow old, he collapsed into age in a single second, a blind, withered, ancient man lying in the dust of the road, and the white horse was gone, and the way back was closed, and it would never open for him again. That is the price the story names out loud. The Otherworld will give you a timeless year for the asking, but the world you left behind does not wait for you, and you can never, ever return to the moment you stepped out of. The same rule runs through the very oldest of these tales, the Voyage of Bran, which was written down more than 1,000 years ago. Bran is lured out to sea by a woman of the Sidhe and a silver branch of white blossom that appears in his hand, and he sails west with his companions, searching for the island she has sung to him about. And on the way, something happens that is the single most precise description of the Otherworld anywhere in the whole literature. Bran meets the sea god himself, riding a chariot across the surface of the open ocean. And the god says to him, in effect, "You and I are looking at the same place and seeing two different worlds. What you see as heaving gray water, I see as a blossoming plain. Where your boat rides over waves, my chariot rolls over flowers. It is the same space. The difference is not in the place. The difference is in who is looking at it and in what they are able to see." That is the whole doctrine carried in a single image. The Otherworld is not far away, and it is not locked behind a distant gate. It is right here, laid over the world you already know, and the only thing standing between you and it is the limit of your own perception. And when Bran and his men finally turn for home, one of them, sick for the sight of Ireland, leaps to the shore before anyone can warn him, and the moment he touches Irish soil, all the centuries he has cheated catch up with him in an instant, and he crumbles to dust on the beach. Bran does not land. He calls out his name to the people standing on the shore, and then he turns his boat back toward the west, into the Otherworld, and no one in the mortal world ever sees him again. There is a second rule, quieter than the first, and it is about the table. To eat or to drink in the Otherworld is to accept its terms. This turns up in myth after myth all across the world, and in Ireland it takes a particular and haunting form. Eating there does not always chain you to the place, but it changes you. It ruins you for home. Everything you taste afterward in the mortal world is thin and gray and never quite enough for the rest of your life, because you have tasted the real thing and nothing here will ever match it again. And there is a third rule, the one that mattered most to the ordinary people who actually lived alongside this belief, and it is about the calendar. The veil is always there, but it is not always the same thickness. 4 times a year, the old world turned on a hinge at the festivals that marked the quarters of the year, and at each of them the membrane grew thin. But there was one night when it did not merely grow thin, it all but dissolved. That night was Samhain, the turn from the last of October into the 1st of November, the end of the harvest and the beginning of the dark half of the year. On that night, the belief held, the doors of the hollow hills stood open, the dead walked back along the roads to the houses they had lived in, and anything at all could cross, in either direction. Remember that night. We are going to come back to it, and when we do, I am going to show you that you already keep it. It would be comfortable to treat all of this as literature, as something that lived in old manuscripts and nowhere else. That would be a serious mistake. Because this belief did not stay on the page, it walked out into the fields and it stayed there, as a working part of ordinary life, century after century, into living memory, into the memory of people whose grandchildren are alive right now. In 1935, the Irish state set up a body to go out into the countryside and record the oral tradition before it could be lost. And its collectors, trained and careful people, gathered tens of thousands of pages of testimony, now kept in Dublin. And the striking thing about that archive is the tone of it. These are not tall tales spun for a laugh by the fire. A great many of them are accounts, sober and specific, from named men and women, about things that they or their neighbors had seen and done. For the country people of Ireland right into the last century, the Sidhe were not characters in a story. They were neighbors. And the most solid proof of that is written on the land itself, in the fairy fort. All across Ireland there are circular earthen banks, ring forts, the remains of farm enclosures that are 2,000 years old and more. To the archaeologists, they are Iron Age homesteads. To the folk tradition, they were something else entirely. They were the surface of the hidden world, the roofs of the houses of the Sidhe, and the rules about them were absolute. You did not plow one. You did not build on one. You did not carry off the stones. And above all, you did not cut the trees that grew on them. And most of all, you never touched the whitethorn. The lone hawthorn standing by itself in the middle of a green field, the fairy thorn, is the single strongest symbol of this belief in the whole Irish landscape. And to cut one down was to invite ruin, the death of your cattle, the failure of your crops, sickness in your family, the quiet departure of every scrap of your luck. And before you decide that all of this is a quaint thing safely locked in the past, let me bring it right up to the present. In 1999, the building of a new bypass in County Clare was stopped, and the whole route was moved at real and considerable public expense because it would have meant destroying a single lone hawthorn that local people insisted was a fairy tree. A folklorist was brought in to advise on the matter. The tree stayed. That was not 1,000 years ago. That was inside the lifetime of most of the people listening to this. The old country left a space for the otherworld, and in the west of Ireland, it still does. But there is a darker side to living next door to the Sidhe, and I promised you, at the start, a child that was carried off and swapped for something that only looked like a child. This is the belief in the changeling, and it is the point where the tradition stops being charming. The idea was this. The Sidhe wanted what was healthy and beautiful in the mortal world, and above all, they wanted certain children, and new mothers in the days just after a birth, and now and then, a fine young man. And when they took one, they left something in its place. Sometimes it was one of their own, wearing the shape of the person they had carried away. Sometimes it was an enchanted stock of wood, glamored to look and move like a living body until, at last, the glamour failed. And the signs that a swap had happened were described in almost the same words, over and over, across the whole island. A child who had been thriving would seem to change. It would grow fretful and thin and impossible to comfort. It would eat and never grow. It would seem strangely old or strangely knowing, and at the very same time lose the ordinary small skills it once had. And above all, it would pine, grieving for something it could not name, in a direction it could not point to. Now we can read that description with clearer eyes than the people who first set it down. What they were describing, in the only language they had, was almost certainly illness and developmental difference, and the conditions we now have names for and care for. A child who seemed to change, who stopped meeting the marks the other children were meeting, was understood through the only framework the whole community possessed, and that framework was the changeling. Understanding it does not make the belief comfortable. Some of what was done to children under that belief was frightening, and it is not the part of the story I am going to linger over. But it does explain why the belief was so widespread and so fiercely held. It gave grief a shape. It gave frightened families a story and something, anything to do, in the face of a change they could not understand and could not stop. And that, in the end, is what a great deal of this tradition was for. Not wonder. Comfort, in a hard world, standing at the edge of the things people could not control. And there is one more visitor from the far side, the most famous of them all, and she is not a monster. She is the Banshee, the woman of the Sidhe, the Banshee, and she has been badly misunderstood. She does not cause death. She does not carry it. She is a guardian, bound to a single family, one of the old families of Ireland, and her task is to grieve for them, in advance. When a death is coming to that family, she is heard at night, keening, raising the long, high lament that Irish women once raised over their dead. She is not warning you in the way that a threat warns you. She simply already knows, because she stands on the far side of the veil, where time is kept differently, and she can see what is coming before it has reached you. Her cry is the sound of a grief that has not happened yet, arriving early. And to the old families she was attached to, she was not a curse, but a strange kind of honor. It meant the Otherworld had not forgotten your name. Your line was old enough, and it mattered enough, that one of the she still kept watch over it, and would raise her voice for you when your time finally came. To have a Banshee was, in the oldest and most Irish sense of the word, to be somebody. So how do you live, day after day, next door to a power like that? Carefully, and with good manners, and with a long, quiet list of small habits that the country people kept without any fuss at all, the way you keep any habit that keeps you safe. You left offerings, a little milk poured out on the doorstep, a share of the best of the harvest set down at the foot of the fairy thorn. On the night of Samhain, you laid an extra place at the table for the dead who were coming home. And there were things you simply did not do. You did not throw dirty water or boiling water out of the door at night without calling a word of warning first, in case one of the she was passing and you scalded them. You did not sweep the dust of the house out over your own threshold after dark. You did not praise a child's beauty out loud without adding a blessing straight after, to turn aside the attention of the very ones who took beautiful children. You did not whistle in the dark near a fairy fort. You did not follow a strange light across the fields at night, however much it seemed to want you to come. These were not the panicked rituals of frightened, ignorant people. They were the settled etiquette of a people who had worked out, across a very long time, exactly how to share a world with a neighbor of immense power and ancient temper, and how to give that neighbor no reason at all to take offense. We have spent all of our time so far in the country of the hills, but there is a second Otherworld, and it is older and stranger, and in some ways, it is the root from which all the rest of it grows. It is the world under the sea, and it has a keeper. His name is Manannán mac Lir, and his second name means son of the sea. He is the steward of the whole hidden country, the one who gave the retreating gods their cloak of invisibility and their deathless ale, and their pigs that never stayed dead. He is the one riding the chariot across the water in the Voyage of Bran. He owns a boat that goes without sail or oar, wherever its master wills it to go. He gives his name to the Isle of Man, sitting out in the middle of the Irish Sea. And the Welsh tell of him too, under a name of their own, which tells us he is old, older than the parting of the Irish and the Welsh, a god who was already ancient when those peoples went their separate ways. And the sea he keeps is not the warm feast of the golden plains. The land under the wave is cold green light and deep pressure and long silence. A world running on rules that are not our rules, because the very stuff it is made of is not our air. And the sea, in this belief, is the most dangerous doorway of them all, because it has no fixed threshold. A hill has one door. The sea is all door. Anywhere on that gray surface, in the right light, in the right frame of mind, the world beneath it can open. And nowhere is that clearer than in the drowned kingdoms. There is a story the Welsh tell of a country called the Lowland Hundred, a wide and fertile land that once lay out where the waves of Cardigan Bay now roll, protected from the sea by a long wall of banks and sluice gates, and kept safe by a single gatekeeper whose one duty was to close those gates against the rising tide. And the gatekeeper, on one terrible night, had drunk too much, and he forgot. The sea came in, and as the water rose over the fields and the roofs and the towers, the bells of the drowned churches rang out on their own beneath the flood. And the people who still tell this story will tell you that on a still evening, when the wind is right and the bay lies flat and calm, you can hear those bells even now, ringing far down under the water. And this is not one strange and lonely local tale. Across the sea, in Brittany, they tell almost exactly the same story, of a great city on the coast, protected by gates that only the king could open, and of a daughter of that king who stole the key and let in the one who drowned it. And the sea took the city, and the king rode clear on his horse, and the city sank. And its bells, too, are said to ring on certain calm days beneath the bay. Two peoples, two drowned cities, and under both of them the same bells, ringing under the water for anyone quiet enough to listen. And here is where the story does something that should raise the hair on your arms, because it stops being only a story. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, the seas of the world stood far lower than they do now. The ice held the water locked up on the land, and the coasts of Ireland and Britain and Brittany ran out much further than they do today. And where there is gray water now, there was dry, walkable, inhabited ground. And as the ice melted, over long, slow centuries, the sea rose, and it took that land back, slowly enough that people could gather their families and move inland, but surely enough, and dramatically enough, that the loss of it burned itself into the memory of everyone who fled. Real coasts drowned. Real ground where real people had built their lives went under the real sea. And it is entirely possible that the legends of the drowned kingdoms, of the bells beneath the bay, are not invention at all, but memory. It may be the oldest memory in Europe, a true thing that happened, passed from mouth to mouth for 12,000 years, until it wore smooth and turned into myth. When you hear of the bells of the sunken land ringing under the water, you may be hearing the echo of something that truly happened at the very dawn of the people who still remember it. And this drowned country is the world the seal people belong to, the Selkies, who come ashore on lonely beaches and slip off their sealskins and walk as men and women, and who, if that skin is stolen and hidden away, can be kept on the land, married, made to live a human life, always with their eyes turning back toward the sea. The stolen skin is not just a coat, it is the doorway. It is the membrane between their world and ours, and without it, they are not free, they are exiles, cut off not only from the water, but from the other world itself, held in a reality that was never theirs, waiting for the day the skin is found again and the sea finally takes them home. So step back now, because we have walked the whole of the map, the hills and the mounds and the sea and the sunken land, and it is time to ask the question that has been lying underneath all of it. What were these people actually saying about the world? And the answer is more serious and more sophisticated than the word fairy will ever let most people guess. There is a word for the kind of belief this is, and the word is immanence. Some traditions imagine a divine that stands above the world, that made it and rules it from somewhere beyond it, apart from it. That is transcendence, the God on the far side of the sky. But the Irish Otherworld is the opposite of that. Here, the divine did not make the world and then step back from it. It sank down into the world and stayed, in the hills, in the sea, in the turning of the year, woven through the ground itself, present, immediate, one layer down. And that belief carries a consequence that is not primitive at all. It means the land is not empty. It is not a stage set, or a store of raw materials, or dead matter waiting for you to come and use it. Every hill and lake and lone tree and crossroads sits in a living relationship with a hidden world that was there long before you and will still be there long after you. And your task, walking through it, is not to master it, but to move through it with care, and with courtesy, and with attention. That is not a foolish way to see a landscape. It is close, in its own older language, to what our best science has only lately begun to teach us, that the visible surface of the living world is held up by an enormous hidden web of relationships we cannot see and interfere with at our peril. The old Irish knew their land was inhabited in ways that ran deeper than the visible. About that, in the way that truly matters, they were right. By every reasonable measure, this belief should not have survived at all. A new faith arrived in Ireland in the 5th century with an official account of the universe that left no room whatever for a parallel country of gods beneath the hills. Long centuries of harsh law tore at the culture that carried it. And then, in the 1840s, the Great Hunger killed and scattered exactly those poor country communities who had kept the tradition most fully alive. It should have died. And yet, at the very end of the 19th century, when the poet Yeats went out into the west of Ireland collecting fairy stories, he did not find a dead tradition preserved like a specimen in a case. He found it alive. The people he spoke with in Sligo and in Galway were not reciting quaint old lore for a visitor. They were telling him, plainly, how things were. And a whole generation of Irish writers, Yeats above all of them, and Lady Gregory, and others beside them, went to that living well and drank from it, not as antiquarians studying a dead thing, but as artists who understood that it held something the modern world was about to lose. It held an openness to the possibility that the visible surface of things is not the whole of the story. Yeats returned to the otherworld for the whole of his life. It gave him a way to speak about the thinness of the line between the waking mind and the deep mind, between history and dream, between the world we live in and the world we can feel pressing up underneath it. In his hands, the fairy faith stopped being folklore and became something else. It became art. And now I owe you the promise I made right at the beginning, the uncomfortable one. I told you that close to 1 billion people on this earth still perform the rituals of this belief every single year and do not know it. Here is how. Cast your mind back to Samhain, the night the veil dissolves, the turn of October into November, when the dead walk home and the doors of the hills stand open. On that night, the old Irish put on disguises so that the things abroad in the dark would not know their faces. They cut frightening faces into turnips and set a light burning inside to guard the threshold. They went from house to house, and food was handed out to the wanderers and to the dead. Now say those 3 customs out loud, slowly, and listen to what you are describing. Costumes, worn so that you will not be recognized. A carved face with a light inside it, set at the door. Going from house to house asking for food on the last night of October. You already keep this feast. The whole world keeps it. It crossed an ocean, it changed its clothes, it forgot its own name, and it became the single most widely celebrated secular festival on the entire planet. And almost no one lighting a lantern on the 31st of October has the faintest idea that they are standing at the door on the night the veil comes down, doing precisely what the old Irish did for precisely the reasons they did it. And it did not stop there. When the modern world dreamed up its greatest fantasy, the tall, ageless, beautiful people who had withdrawn from the company of ordinary men into a hidden country of their own, the elves of the books that shaped nearly everything that came after them, it was reaching, whether it knew it or not, straight back to the Tuatha Dé Danann, the divine people who went under the hills. The gods of Ireland stepped one layer down into the dark, and from there, quietly and patiently, they went on to conquer the imagination of the whole world. So let me carry you back to where we started, to the hill in the west at dusk, with the wind dropped and the birds gone silent, and the ground beginning, once again, to feel like a door. The question I asked you then, I can answer now. What if the fairy faith was never superstition? What if it was theology all along? It was. It is a theology of presence, and it says something plain and demanding. It says the world is larger than you can see. It says the powers in it are older than you are. It says the rules that hold reality together run further than your senses can reach, and that your place in the middle of all of it is not to stand above the world and own it, but to move through it, carefully, as a guest, in a house that was standing long before you, and will stand long after you are gone. It does not promise you comfort. The Sidhe are not your protectors. They are your neighbors, and like any powerful neighbor of ancient habit, they ask for courtesy and respect and attention. And attention in the end is the whole of it. The Otherworld, the old people understood, does not ask you to believe in it. It only asks you to pay attention. The hill is still there. In the right light, at the right hour, the ground still stops feeling like ground and starts feeling like a door. It always will. The only question, the same question it has always been, is whether you are paying enough attention to notice the moment it opens. If something in you woke up while you listened tonight, a curiosity or a memory or a feeling you cannot quite put a name to, then this is where you belong. Subscribe and stay with us, because every story we tell is a crossing exactly like this one into the myths and the mysteries of the world that came before the modern age arrived and set about explaining all of it away. And before you go, tell me in the comments which door you want to open next. The full story of Manannán and the sea? The short, blazing, doomed life of Cuchulainn? The fairy faith of the Scottish Highlands and how it differs from the Irish one? The map of the Otherworld is vast, and tonight we have only just stepped over the threshold.